Good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this Sigmund short talk. My name's Stefan, and I'm one of the learning managers here at the museum, the Freud Museum, and I look after the schools program here. My brief was to talk for about 20 minutes on a subject of my choosing, and the title I've gone for is Why Are We So Miserable? Okay, and what I'm going to be doing is basically a sort of potted summary of one of Freud's books called Civilisation and its Discontents. And I thought to do it in the form of a kind of angry rant. Okay. Freud starts the book by his opening gambit in this book, Civilization and its Discontents, is to consider something that Romain Rolland, this French author, has said to him, some comments on what Rolland calls the Oceanic Feeling. Now, the Oceanic Feeling is it's coined by Romain Rolland, not Freud, and what Rolland is describing there is a sense of eternity, a sense of limitlessness and oneness with the universe that he thinks that, gets taken up by the world's religions and then channeled. Okay, so it's like looks like, kind of like for Rolland's, this oceanic feeling is a sort of source of all religious sentiments. And Freud's reading of it is that it's going to be a kind of relaxation between the self and the world. So a relaxation of the boundaries of the ego. So what's happening in that oceanic feeling is that we're experiencing self and world in a kind of continuity. So most of the time we experience it ourselves as distinct from the outside world, but the boundary between self and world isn't actually as stable as we might like to think, according to Freud. And at certain points, particularly around themes of sex and love, the boundary becomes blurred. And also, Freud wants to point out that our sense of self isn't actually there from the start. Okay, so it's the result of a process of development. Okay, so for Freud, a newborn baby doesn't really distinguish between me and not me. It just experiences a kind of continuity of sensations. So first, there's what Freud calls a primary sense of self, which exists prior to any recognition of a boundary between self and world. And secondly, and after that, what Freud calls a, quote, narrower, more sharply defined sense of self that kicks in as we grow up. And that's going to be linked to things, to terms like identification and separation. Okay. But Freud that said, Freud disagrees with Rolland's claim that the oceanic feeling is the source of all religious feeling. Freud's going to argue there that actually it's secondary. Okay. And what he thinks is primary is a certain vulnerability, a certain helplessness, and a certain need for protection. And there's a quote that gets shared quite a lot on the internet. It's from this book where Freud says, "I can't think of a greater need in childhood than that of a father's protection." Okay, which you can even get it in Father's Day cards. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. So how does Freud build his argument in Civilization and its Discontents? Freud's starting point is that, as a rule, we're all miserable. And for Freud, that's just a basic observation of his psychoanalytic clinic. It's one of the strange findings of psychoanalysis that beyond appearances, no one's happy. Everyone's misery. And for Freud, in a very sort of basic, simplistic way, religion basically steps in to inject meaning into the misery by deluding us into thinking that life has some kind of a purpose. And Freud even goes so far as to suggest that the claim that life has a meaning is fundamentally a religious and fictitious claim. So the idea that any of us who've become convinced that life has some sort of a meaning, even if we're not religious, for Freud, we're experiencing a delusion. Okay, so what kind of purpose do people ascribe to their lives? Now, if you go to the pub and you ask someone in the pub what they think about the purpose of life, you ask them one of those big questions, they're probably going to tell you something pretty boring. Okay, they're probably going to say something like, "Oh, well, so we're all going to make the most of it while we can, and let's all be happy." you're very unlikely to meet someone in the pub who's going to turn around and say, well, life is essentially, ceaseless, blind suffering in a godless, indifferent universe. And that our tragedy as human beings is that we can't help but deceive ourselves into thinking that it means something. Okay. So that in a sense, for Freud, we're victims of our meaning-making apparatus. It's our tragedy. Okay. It's a tragedy of our feeble-mindedness that we think we live in a meaningful universe. Freud observes that, generally speaking, in life, we strive for happiness and we strive to avoid misery. The problem is, happiness is actually quite difficult to come by. Not only that, but it's not something we can really sustain as a permanent state of affairs. So happiness, it's always fleeting moments of satisfaction in a human life. And it gets worse because not only is happiness always fleeting and quite hard to come by, but also misery is always close at hand. And according to Freud, the three obvious sources of misery in a human life are: one, our bodies, which will decay and die, but not before causing us significant pain; two, the external world, which is full of danger and destruction; and three, lastly, interestingly enough, other people. So it's not that we're not pleasure-seeking creatures. It's just that for Freud, most of the time, the best we can manage, the best we can muster is to be pain-avoiding creatures. Yeah. So for Freud, it's really not surprising that we've learned, or we're supposed to have learned, to manage our expectations when it comes to happiness. Okay, to count ourselves lucky that we're not just in a constant state of pain, anguish, and torment. Yeah, or not consciously, at least. For Freud, there's really no one-size-fits-all way to navigate all of this, and it's up to each of us to find our own individual ways of coping with the miseries of existence and finding some consolation. And he lists off, very interesting, he lists off a few ways to handle the inevitable misery of existence. So here's Freud's list. One, trying to tame our unruly bodily drives and direct them towards less intense satisfactions. Okay, so, instead of killing your boss, you go home and kick the cat. Yeah. Two, trying to divert our pleasure-seeking instincts into intellectual or artistic or scientific pursuits. Okay, so that's what Freud calls sublimation. Okay, so instead of sitting around masturbating all day, you become a contemporary artist. Yeah. Three, joining a mass movement of people to attempt what Freud calls a delusional reshaping of reality. So Freud's talking about a religion, but you could extend that, a cult of some kind of conspiracy theory, an internet subculture, a political movement, whatever. Okay, so a delusional reshaping of reality. Four, turning away from the world and becoming a hermit. Five, getting drunk. And six, becoming ill. Okay, because for Freud, neurotic illness is fundamentally linked to an economy of satisfaction. Yeah, people become ill when too much of a sacrifice is imposed on them. That's Freud's list. Now, the problem is the methods we use to avoid misery also diminish the possibilities that are available to us for happiness. Okay, because kicking the cat, while pleasurable, is not nearly as pleasurable as killing someone that you don't like. So, and as long as our drives are only partially satisfied, we're going to end up being irresistibly drawn towards forbidden things and developing all kinds of symptoms and perversions. And interestingly enough, one factor that Freud singles out as a major source of misery in a human life is, quote, how much satisfaction one can expect to obtain from the world. So how much satisfaction we expect. And perhaps that point's particularly relevant to our times, considering that under the conditions of capitalism, we're just bombarded with messages about the abundance of satisfactions available to us, which we're supposed to be pursuing like it's some sort of a sacred ethical duty. Freud's contention is that much of our misery is actually caused by civilization. Now, isn't that counterintuitive? Don't we usually think of civilization as protecting us from suffering? Yeah, apparently not. Okay, so disillusionment with civilization is pretty widespread, and for Freud, it's pretty deep-rooted. Now, what is civilization? Freud comes up with various definitions. He's particularly interested in how civilization functions to bind people together into larger and larger groups and communities. And he spends quite a lot of time in that book, Civilisation and its Discontents, speculating about how that process has unfolded over history. But he's also interested in how becoming civilized hasn't really worked out that well for us at all. Why hasn't it worked out? One thing that Freud sees as a defining feature of civilization is the regulation of social relations. So he argues that as soon as you've got that, you've got civilization. As soon as you've got the regulation of social relations. And without that, you'd just be in a sort of dog-eat-dog world where it's survival of the fittest and so on. So once you've got regulation of social relations, you've got civilization, and there's a kind of power shift. And the power shift is that the collective power of the community gets the upper hand over the power of any given individual. Okay, so that's the shift. And Freud's argument is that the essence of that shift is what he calls renunciation. So in other words, it's that civilization demands a sacrifice. Everyone who has the laws of social life imposed on them has had to restrict their possibilities for satisfaction. So, the price we pay for entering into the social order is a loss in the order of satisfaction. And given that what Freud says, what he has to say about the misadventure that is human sexuality, the obvious conclusion is that this is inevitable and that the laws of civilization are imposed on us and are ultimately imposed on our very bodies. The problem is that the individual's pursuit of happiness ends up coming into conflict with the sacrifices that civilization imposes on the individual. Okay, and Freud sees that as mankind's great struggle, okay, to find a livable balance between the demands of civilization and the individual's search for happiness. He asks a question: is a harmony possible? So can we envisage a civilization that gets that balance right? Yeah, and the stakes are high in this question because what's at stake is the idea of progress. Yeah. If it's just a matter of finding the right social configuration, finding the right balance, then we can still preserve the idea of progress. We can still think of civilization as gradually progressing towards some, form of utopia. But if that perfect equilibrium, that balance, is structurally impossible, it opens up the much more disturbing possibility that the tension between individual and society is increasing, and the possibility that civilization is on a path to self-destruction. Now, just to recap, Freud's argument is human beings are inhabited by powerful bodily drives that are pushing for satisfaction, and that civilization is built on the sacrifice of those satisfactions. His argument isn't just that civilization demands that we let go of a part of our sexuality. It's not only that, it's that civilization appropriates that part of human sexuality for its own purpose of binding communities together in what Freud calls aim-inhibited affection. So the sexuality that civilization appropriates in that way gets withdrawn from the individual. It becomes unavailable. So as social beings, the idea is that we're marked by a loss of satisfaction. And that the other side of that is, of course, that the individual's sexuality becomes something that's threatening to civilization, and civilization has to take restrictive measures against it. For Freud, that's one of the reasons that we tend to be hostile towards civilization. Yeah, it's taken something from us. And it's also the reason that we tend to be hostile towards one another. In Freud's book, Civilization and its Discontents, there's a famous discussion about the biblical commandment, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Yeah. And Freud comments, why the hell would I want to do that? Okay, why should I love my neighbor? First of all, my neighbor might not deserve my love. And even if he did, it would do an injustice to the people that I really love. Yeah, my close friends and family. Yeah. Secondly, I put myself in a very vulnerable position by loving my neighbor. He might use my love to harm me or to exploit me. So according to Freud, what that commandment to love thy neighbor screens out is that human beings are not gentle creatures. Okay, my neighbor's not just a potential sort of object of my love, but also someone that I might enjoy attacking or exploiting, deceiving, abusing, robbing, humiliating, causing pain, torturing, or killing. Yeah. So the whole reason that the commandment to love thy neighbor was there in the first place is because it doesn't come naturally to human beings to love their neighbors. Okay. What Freud brings into focus is a human tendency towards aggression, which constantly threatens society. And that's what the commandment to love thy neighbor is really there to manage. So love thy neighbor. Yeah. But Freud argues that the commandment to love thy neighbor only really works against what he calls the crudest excesses of brutal violence. It does nothing to counter what he calls, quote, the subtler manifestations of human aggression. And in a sense, it even encourages them. Now, the subtler manifestations of human aggression, that's a very interesting concept, and it's difficult to know what that might include. But then again, maybe it's not so difficult. I asked a few friends, and this is what we came up with. Here's a few suggestions. The subtler manifestations of human aggression: racism, misogyny, xenophobia, bullying, scapegoating, body shaming, undermining, belittling, passive aggression, gaslighting, microaggressions, systemic injustice, structural violence, cultures of enablement, othering practices, road rage, mansplaining. In a nutshell, the whole spectrum of how we compulsively make life miserable for one another. And not only that, but what Freud calls our more basic brute aggression hasn't really been tamed either. So he calls our aggressive tendencies an indestructible feature of our human nature. They're just being inhibited by counterforces, yeah, like the commandment to love thy neighbor, which diverts them into all those sort of subtle and not so subtle microaggressions. But under the right conditions, Freud thinks those counterforces evaporate and violence erupts. So, for Freud, civilization imposes a sacrifice not only on sexuality, but also on aggression. We know what happens to the sexuality we sacrifice. It gets used to bind communities together in relations of aim-inhibited affection, so fraternal ties to bind together communities. That's what happens to the sexuality, according to Freud. But where does the aggression go? Freud's quite disturbing answer is it gets turned inwards. It gets turned against ourselves. More precisely, it gets taken over by the superego and used to attack the ego in the form of conscience. Now, Freud's findings about the superego contradict a lot of popular ideas about conscience. For a start, Freud doesn't think human beings have got any kind of built-in moral compass, okay? The moral values of the superego are not hardwired. They've been internalized through development. Now, what creates the superego? Well, Freud's idea is this. When we're very small and helpless and very much dependent on our parents, we start to form the impression that we'll lose their love and protection if we don't go along with the rules and ideals that they're imposing on us. Okay, so that quote that Freud writes, I cannot think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for a father's protection. It gets bandied around all the time, like you can, it's in Father's Day cards, it's on the internet. I cannot think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for a father's protection. But the fact is, Freud wrote those words in the context of a discussion about how the need for a father's protection essentially lays the foundation for much of the guilt and self-loathing and self-destructive tendencies that haunt us as human beings. So the superego, how does it start? Well, it starts out as, do this, don't do that, be a good boy, be a good girl, yeah? And at that basic embryonic stage, the childhood stage, it's basically just a fear of, the consequences of not doing what we're told. It's a fear of being found out by the authorities, a fear of a loss of love. But as we move through childhood and we identify with our parents, that has the effect of internalizing their authority. So there's a movement from outside to inside. And that's where things start to get out of hand. How do things get out of hand? Well, first of all, because with this internalization, with the superego, our conscience is never clear. Even if we act according to moral ideals, the superego can read our thoughts and intentions. So even after we've given up on a forbidden satisfaction, the superego still has access to that layer of our history where we hadn't given up on it. And it never lets up. So the superego considers the ego to be essentially sinful, and it never passes up an opportunity to incriminate us, to steer us into situations where it'll have grounds for attacking us or to expose us to punishment. A second feature of the superego that's very disturbing. The superego isn't really concerned with whether we're psychologically capable of meeting its demands. And you almost get the impression that it's deliberately unreasonable in its demands, that it's setting traps for us in the form of impossible demands in order to discharge its aggression onto us. Third disturbing feature is that the superego is turbocharged, it's supercharged by what Freud calls the death drive. And the death drive, that's not just a drive that aims at causing pain and suffering. It aims at total destruction, yeah? And in the life of the organism, it always wins. Fourth disturbing thing is that the superego has got a very peculiar and counterintuitive characteristic. It becomes the more severe, the more we act morally. Yeah. So at first there's the imposition of rules that force us to sort of give up on some satisfactions. But once the superego develops, it becomes the other way round. Yeah. Freud writes, every renunciation of the drives now becomes a fresh source of conscience. Every fresh renunciation reinforces its severity. So what happens is that a kind of psychological feedback loop emerges. The superego sets up an impossible moral ideal that compels us to renounce our aggressive tendencies. And then it takes control of those aggressive tendencies that we've renounced and uses them to attack us. And it attacks us with a kind of ferocious energy that's usually completely out of proportion to the apparent transgression. Yeah, if you think of, the example of the phenomenon of the guilt trip. Yeah. And that's how the noose tightens. That's how conscience works for human beings. So that superego, it's not a benign agency. It's not that angel that sits on your shoulder and tells you to do the right thing like it is in the textbooks. Yeah. The superego is not an angel. It's a sadist. Yeah. And what does it thrive on? It thrives on the ideals of civilization. And by the way, I think that's a clue as to why Freudians are sometimes suspicious of forms of therapy that seek to adapt people to the ideals and expectations and standards of civilization, which we see so much of today. And because of all this, the superego puts human beings into a state of what Freud calls permanent internal unhappiness in the form of a tension between the ego and its ideals. And perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of the superego is that, for the most part, all of that happens outside our conscious awareness. Okay, Freud discovers that superego is at work all the time, and not just when we're consciously feeling guilty. It's not just in the guilt trip. So a very common human experience is to have a split-second attack of hatred and aggression when someone mildly inconveniences us. Okay, so think about road rage, yeah? Or if you've ever been on public transport and there's like a tourist standing in the wrong place and they blocks your way, and for a split second you have a murderous thought towards them, yeah? And then a split second later you forget it, and you walk off thinking that you're not that person, but the fact is you had a murderous impulse. Well, for Freud, what's happening there is that for a split second, for a fleeting moment, we're redirecting onto someone else what's in fact a constant invisible pressure on our own selves. So when Freud says human beings are not gentle creatures, of course he's right, but in a certain sense, he's also tragically wrong. Yeah, he's tragically wrong, because thanks to the effects of civilization, a lot of the time we do succeed in being gentle and kind towards one another, but only insofar as we manage to divert our vast capacity for aggression inwards towards ourselves. Because civilization follows the principle of what Freud calls eros, yeah, of binding human beings together into large groups, it can only achieve that goal, that binding, by reinforcing the superego to a degree that becomes increasingly impossible to endure. And just to add a final disturbing characteristic of the superego, is that for the most part, we don't consciously experience the superego's devastating cruelty as guilt. What we experience instead is just a strange sense of malaise, a strange kind of uneasiness, of things not being quite right, yeah, of things being somehow out of joint, yeah? And that is what Freud calls the discontent in civilization. According to Freud, we've got to reckon with the possibility that that tension is going to increase until it becomes unbearable, okay? Until we're no longer able to endure the sacrifices that civilization imposes on us, or the vast superegoic pressure that accompanies them. The question becomes, what then? Well, what then? We can infer from Freud's work, by the way, which was written in the 1930s, yeah, that the most likely outcome would be something like this. The erosion of social bonds, yeah? So libido that was formerly invested in the social bond withdraws. And when it withdraws, it floods the ego, throwing the ego into a narcissistic, paranoid state. Massive outbursts of aggression. And then either the principle of eros steps in to restore a fragile equilibrium, which Freud thinks might happen, but his thinking about that is a bit forced, or it doesn't, and society disintegrates. And that is the basic argument of Freud's book, Civilization and its Discontents. Thank you.